A renowned pianist mockingly asked a visually impaired black teenager to perform at the piano. The young man possessed extraordinary musical abilities. "Come on, son, why don't you play something for our guests?" "I'm confident you're familiar with Happy Birthday," called out the celebrated pianist Vincent Sterling's voice throughout the magnificent hall of the Lincoln Arts Center, generating subdued chuckles from New York's musical aristocracy. At 16 years old, David Thompson remained perfectly still next to the grand Steinway piano. His fingers gripped his white walking stick firmly as uncomfortable quiet enveloped the space. The teenager had accompanied his public school music instructor, who had secured 2 invitations to the season's most exclusive charitable concert. Vincent smoothed his designer tuxedo and grinned at the crowd of benefactors and music reviewers. At 42, he was regarded as one of the finest interpreters of Chopin in contemporary times, with completely booked international tours and contracts worth millions. In his view, this out-of-place youth embodied all the problems with inclusive policies at cultural gatherings. "Go ahead, don't be timid," Vincent pressed, his tone saturated with patronizing attitude. "I'm certain our generous contributors would enjoy witnessing how we support diversity initiatives." Ms. Patricia Wells, the Organizing Foundation's director, mumbled something about this being inappropriate to her aide, yet chose not to step in. Vincent Sterling was, after all, the evening's main attraction, responsible for generating millions for the organization. David inhaled deeply, his grip tightening on his walking stick. Nobody present understood that he dedicated 8 hours daily to practicing on a borrowed keyboard in the local church's basement. Nobody realized that by age 3, he could replicate complete symphonies after a single listening. Most crucially, nobody suspected that at this very moment, while everyone perceived him as an unwelcome burden, he was absorbing every musical note, every harmony, every detail of the arrogance permeating the atmosphere. "As a matter of fact," David stated, his composed voice piercing through the murmur of side conversations, "I have a preference for Bach." Vincent released an authentic laugh. "Bach, indeed? Which composition would you be able to perform, young fellow?" The distinguished pianist's expression was on the verge of freezing when David responded with a tranquility that exists only in individuals who possess a secret too profound to reveal until the appropriate moment. Partita No. 2 in C minor. However, it might be somewhat too sophisticated for this gathering. The quietness that ensued was so dense that the antique entrance hall clock's ticking became audible. Something about the boy's stance, the understated confidence in his speech, made several guests understand they were about to observe something far exceeding mere embarrassment. If this tale of triumph over bias captivates you, remember to subscribe to our channel to discover how a moment of ridicule transformed into the most crushing lesson New York's musical establishment would ever experience. Vincent Sterling experienced a flash of annoyance at the youth's unexpected reply. Partita No. 2 in C minor ranked among Bach's most technically and emotionally challenging works, notorious for overwhelming seasoned pianists. "How audacious of this child to imply the audience lacked sophistication," Vincent echoed, his voice adopting a harsher edge. "Young man, you're addressing individuals who support the world's premier orchestras. It seems you don't comprehend your current location." The crowd murmured their agreement. Margaret Rothschild, heir to a financial empire and the Foundation's primary supporter, whispered to her companion, "Such impudence! Someone must instruct this generation in proper etiquette." David stayed motionless, though something in his cane-holding posture shifted subtly. His fingers no longer shook. Instead, they became entirely calm, resembling a surgeon's hands before precise procedure. "Vincent," interrupted Dr. Harrison Webb, the Boston Symphony Orchestra's conductor, "perhaps we should proceed with tonight's main agenda." "Absolutely not," Vincent interrupted, now visibly irritated by the perceived defiance. "Young David appears to doubt our guest's refinement. I believe it's appropriate for him to display this musical excellence he's suggesting." Vincent approached the piano and performed the partita's opening measures with exaggerated, almost theatrical gestures. "You see, David, this composition demands not merely technical skill, but emotional wisdom that requires decades to cultivate. Are you certain you wish to put yourself in such a vulnerable position?" Vincent remained unaware that David understood every subtle aspect of that performance. For 8 years, since losing his vision in the automobile accident that also claimed his parents' lives, he had committed every available moment to music, not as a pastime or due to innate ability, but from sheer necessity. Music was his sole method of processing anguish that language couldn't express. His Aunt Deborah, employed as a custodian at the city's music conservatory, had provided him access to exceptional recordings and Braille musical scores. David had committed hundreds of compositions to memory, examining not only the musical notes but the historical performances, regional interpretations, and emotional backgrounds of each composer. Dr. Sterling, David said, intentionally using an incorrect title, you performed those opening measures in D major. Partita number 2 was composed in C minor. A frozen silence fell over the room. Vincent felt blood rushing to his face. He had purposely altered the key to test the boy's actual knowledge of the piece, but hadn't anticipated being publicly corrected. Naturally, that was deliberate. Vincent lied, his voice losing its refined smoothness. I was evaluating his fundamental musical perception. I understand, David replied with composure that made several guests shift uneasily in their seats. Then you're also aware that Bach created this partita following his first wife Maria Barbara's death. Each section reflects a mourning stage. This is why proper performance requires more than technical ability. It demands having experienced genuine loss. The statement struck Vincent like a physical blow. His personal interpretation of the piece had always been technically flawless yet emotionally hollow, lacking the profound depth that true expert consistently noticed but never deigned mention. Excellent, Vincent said, his mask of superiority beginning to fracture. Since you possess such extensive knowledge of music theory, how about demonstrating it practically? Or would you prefer to continue dazzling us with your encyclopedic understanding? David approached the piano, carefully resting his cane against the bench. His hands located the keys with the accuracy of someone who had mentally mapped countless keyboards. One inquiry before I start, David said, turning slightly toward the audience. Has anyone present ever lost everything they cherished in a single instant and been forced to reconstruct their spirit note by note? The silence that followed differed from the previous ones. It wasn't social discomfort anymore, but recognition. Some guests began understanding they were observing something much more profound than a simple musical display. Vincent felt a wave of apprehension. Something about the boy's bearing, the way his hands hovered above the keys, indicated the evening wouldn't follow the humiliating scenario he had orchestrated. What these privileged individuals couldn't perceive was that every condescending remark, every pitying look, every attempt to diminish him was nourishing something far more potent than resentment. It was awakening the type of strength that emerges only from suffering converted into purpose. David was preparing to demonstrate that underestimating someone who has lost everything constitutes the most perilous error one can make. David's question lingered in the air like a held note, generating uncomfortable silence that made several guests fidget in their chairs. Vincent felt mounting frustration at the boy's persistent defiance. Enough superficial philosophy, Vincent interrupted, his voice completely abandoning its social courtesy. Either perform now or depart so we can continue with this evening's serious program. Margaret Rothschild whispered audibly enough to be overheard. Honestly, I don't understand why we permit just anyone into these gatherings. Standards must be upheld. David nodded slowly, his hands still suspended above the keys. You're correct about standards. They truly matter. His voice carried a calmness that made Dr. Webb frown, as though he detected something others couldn't yet perceive. In the fifth row, Deborah Thompson instantly recognized the tone in her nephew's voice. It was identical to the one he used before solving impossible mathematical problems, or when he was about to reveal something he'd been secretly preparing. She had worked at the conservatory long enough to understand that David wasn't merely talented. He was prodigious in a way few comprehended. David, Vincent insisted, now clearly losing patience, will you perform or not? Because I can assure you that nobody here has unlimited time for your philosophical contemplations. Actually, David replied, adjusting his position on the bench, I'd like to modify the proposal slightly. Instead of partita number 2, how about something more instructive for the audience? Vincent laughed scornfully. Educational. Child, you're speaking to people who finance entire conservatories. What precisely could you teach us? David turned slightly toward the audience, his sightless eyes appearing to see beyond everyone's social facades. How about illustrating the distinction between playing notes accurately and creating music? A murmur swept through the audience. Some guests exchanged confused glances while others seemed insulted by the suggestion. How presumptuous, Patricia Wells muttered to her assistant, as if someone like him could differentiate between superior technique and whatever he believes he can accomplish. Vincent felt himself losing command of the situation. This child was clearly attempting to manipulate the audience, create some sort of dramatic scene. It was time to conclude this performance permanently. Very well, Vincent said, moving toward the piano. Since you desire to provide instruction, I'll demonstrate first how the partita should be performed by someone who has genuinely studied music. David stepped away from the bench, allowing Vincent to sit. What the famous pianist failed to notice was a nearly imperceptible smile crossing the boy's face, not one of nervousness, but of someone who had positioned his adversary exactly where he wanted him. Vincent began playing with his characteristic technical precision. Every note was perfectly placed, every rhythm flawlessly measured. It was an impressive exhibition of musical expertise developed over decades of formal training. As Vincent played, David closed his eyes and did something he had mastered years ago. He memorized not just the notes, but every nuance of the interpretation, every stylistic decision, every microscopic pause. In his mind, he was capturing the entire performance, cataloging every element he could use against his opponent. Deborah observed her nephew with a mixture of pride and concern. She recognized that concentration. It was identical to what David displayed when he spent hours studying recordings of deceased masters, analyzing their interpretations like a detective examining evidence. Dr. Webb, seated in the third row, also noticed something different about the boy's posture. There was a stillness about him that reminded him of great performers before career-defining shows, a calmness that came not from resignation, but from complete preparation. Vincent concluded the partita with a dramatic flourish, clearly satisfied with himself. The audience applauded politely, some commenting on his impeccable technique and mature interpretation. "And now," Vincent said, rising and gesturing grandly toward the piano, "let's observe how you interpret this piece that clearly exceeds your abilities." David approached the bench again, but before sitting, he did something unexpected. He turned to the audience and said, "Before I begin, I'd like you to understand something about the music you just heard." Vincent frowned. "What are you talking about?" Partita number 2 wasn't written merely as a technical exercise, David continued, his voice taking on an authority that made the entire room pay attention. Bach composed it as a conversation with grief. Each movement represents a different phase of mourning for his wife Maria Barbara's loss. Some guests leaned forward, intrigued by the change in tone. The first movement, David continued, represents denial. The music refuses to accept the loss's reality. The second is anger against God, against fate, against the music itself for failing to resurrect the dead. Vincent rolled his eyes. Any first-year student knows that. You're not impressing anyone with basic historical context. David smiled again, but this time the smile reached his eyes. "You're right. Historical context is simple to memorize, but experiencing that pain personally, that changes everything." He sat at the piano and placed his hands on the keys. "The difference, Dr. Sterling, between your interpretation and mine isn't technical. It's that you played the notes Bach wrote. I'm going to play the tears he shed." The silence that followed was unlike any of the previous ones. There was electric anticipation in the air, as if everyone sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. In the fifth row, Deborah clenched her fists. She knew David wasn't just about to play music. He was about to bare his soul to strangers who had spent the entire evening underestimating him. It was both brave and terrifying. Vincent remained standing beside the piano, his expression oscillating between irritation and growing apprehension. Something about the boy's stance, the quiet confidence of his movements, suggested the night wouldn't end as he had planned. David took a deep breath and closed his eyes. In his mind, he was no longer in that room full of people who despised him. He was back to that terrible day 8 years ago when he awakened in the hospital and discovered he would never see his parents' faces again, that he would never see anything again. When his hands touched the partita's first notes, something magical occurred in the whole. It wasn't just the same notes Vincent had played minutes before. It was those same notes transformed by lived experience, by real pain, by genuine loss that had shaped every fiber of David's being. That's when everyone realized they had completely underestimated this blind boy from the outskirts, not just his technical ability, but the emotional depth he carried within him, and that he was about to use every ounce of accumulated suffering to transform his humiliation into something none of them would ever forget. The first notes emerging from the piano made Vincent Sterling involuntarily step back. They weren't just the same notes he had played minutes before. They were those same notes transfigured by a soul that had known darkness and found light in music. David played the partita as if he were speaking directly to Bach across the centuries. Each musical phrase carried the weight of his own experience. The brutal denial of loss at age 8, the anger against a world that saw him only as an obstacle, and finally the transformative acceptance that had shaped his sacred relationship with music. "My God," whispered Dr. Webb, leaning forward in his chair. In his 40-year musical career, he had never heard a performance with such emotional depth. Vincent felt his legs trembling. The boy's technique was not only flawless, it was superior to his own. The passages he had played with concentrated effort flowed from David's fingers like crystal-clear water, as natural and inevitable as breathing. Margaret Rothschild, who minutes earlier had scoffed at the boy's audacity, now had tears streaming down her carefully applied makeup. David's music wasn't just technically perfect. It was transformative, touching places in her soul she had forgotten existed. "How is this possible?" Patricia Wells whispered to her assistant, her voice trembling with genuine emotion. The answer came in the form of the music itself. David wasn't just playing the partita. He was retelling his story through it. The first movement became the narrative of a child who lost everything in an instant. The second, the rage of a teenager forced to navigate a world that saw him as inferior before it even knew him. Vincent watched, paralyzed, as his own interpretation was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into something infinitely more powerful. Every musical choice he had made for decades, technically correct but emotionally empty, was being exposed by the raw genius of the boy he had tried to humiliate. When David reached the third movement, something extraordinary happened in the room. The movement that represents acceptance and transcendence in Bach philosophy took on an almost spiritual dimension. David was no longer playing for the audience. He was playing through them, connecting every person in the room to the universal experience of loss and rebirth. "Vincent," whispered Dr. Webb, his voice heavy with awe, "this boy is one of the greatest natural talents I have ever witnessed." Vincent felt something shattered inside his chest. It wasn't just his pride. It was the entire structure of superiority he had built over his lifetime. This blind black kid from the projects wasn't just better than him. He was better than any pianist Vincent had ever known. The entire room was now completely silent except for the transcendent music flowing from the piano. People who had come there to flaunt their social status were now confronted with something genuine and too powerful to be ignored or diminished. David approached the partita's climax, and it was then that Vincent realized the full extent of his own arrogance. Every movement of the boy revealed years of intensive study, fierce discipline, and an understanding of music that transcended formal education. This was not amateur talent. This was musical genius that had been forged in adversity. "He memorized our entire conversation," Vincent muttered to himself, the realization hitting him like lightning. Every condescending tone, every word of contempt. He knew exactly what he was doing. Deborah Thompson in the fifth row smiled through her tears. She had watched David practice until his hands bled, studied Braille sheet music late into the night, memorized interpretations of masters long dead. Now, finally, the world was witnessing what she had always known existed. Vincent looked around the room and saw his own destruction reflected in the faces of the musical elite. Margaret Rothschild watched him with an expression that mixed disappointment and disgust. Dr. Webb shook his head slowly, clearly re-evaluating everything he thought about Vincent Sterling. "How dare you?" Patricia Wells whispered, her gaze fixed on Vincent. "Try to humiliate a child with such an extraordinary gift." Vincent tried to form a response, but the words died in his throat. There was no explanation that could justify what he had done. He had tried to use his privileged position to crush a boy who represented everything music should be: pure, honest, and transformative. David concluded the partita with a delicacy that made the silence that followed seem sacred. His hands remained on the keys for a moment, as if sealing a pact with the music he had just unleashed. When he finally stood up and turned to face the audience, there was no arrogant triumph on his face, just a quiet dignity of someone who had shared his soul and knew he had honored both Bach and his own journey. The ovation that followed was unlike anything that room had ever witnessed. It wasn't just applause, it was simultaneous recognition, apology, and celebration. People rose as if they were in the presence of something divine. Vincent stood motionless, watching his reputation be rewritten in real time. Every person in the room now knew that he had tried to crush a musical genius out of pure prejudice. In 15 minutes, David had completely destroyed the image Vincent had spent decades building. "Mr. Sterling," said Dr. Webb, approaching with an expression that mixed disappointment and contempt, "I think we have a lot to discuss regarding the future of your contract with our orchestra." Margaret Rothschild took out her phone, and Vincent knew instinctively that news of his humiliation would be circulating among the cultural elite before he even left the building. David approached Vincent, extending his hand. "Thank you for the opportunity to play, Dr. Sterling. Sometimes we need to be confronted with our own music to understand who we really are." Vincent shook the boy's hand with trembling fingers, finally understanding that he had just witnessed not only an extraordinary performance, but his own complete social downfall. As David received congratulations from the entire elite in attendance, Vincent Sterling, the man who had tried to use privilege to crush talent, discovered that music, like justice, has its own ways of balancing the scales of life. 6 months after that night at Lincoln Arts Center, David Thompson walked through the halls of the prestigious Juilliard School of Music as a full scholarship student. At 17, he had become the youngest student ever to receive a full scholarship in the institution's history. Dr. Harrison Webb, who had witnessed his devastating performance, had personally ensured that David received the best educational opportunities available. "Talent like this appears once in a generation," he repeated to anyone who questioned investing so much in a kid from the projects. The practice room where David spent his mornings overlooked Central Park, a stark contrast to the damp basement of the church where he had learned to play. But more important than the surroundings was the recognition. His teachers didn't see him as a charity project, but as a future master who would grace any stage on which he performed. Margaret Rothschild, who had mocked him that night, now personally funded his program of study and had established a foundation to identify other musical talents overlooked in poor communities. "That boy taught me that privilege without purpose is just waste," she confessed in an interview with the New York Times. While David flourished, Vincent Sterling faced a very different reality. His contract with major orchestras were canceled one by one. The video of David's performance and the cruel attempt at humiliation that preceded it had gone viral, racking up millions of views and devastating comments about prejudice disguised as cultural elitism. Vincent tried a European tour, but even there the story had caught up with him. Music critics wrote reviews that questioned not only his technique, but his humanity. "Sterling plays the right notes, but his music lacks the soul we witness in that young prodigy," wrote the influential Guardian critic. Patricia Wells, the foundation's director, had been forced to resign after public exposure of how she had allowed charity events to become stages for prejudice. The board of directors made it clear that associating the institution's image with discrimination was unacceptable under any circumstances. Deborah Thompson watched her nephew prepare for another solo performance at Carnegie Hall, this time as a featured artist, not a tolerated spectator. She thought about how the accident that had robbed David of his sight had also revealed a gift that might never have blossomed under normal circumstances. "Don't you feel angry about what happened?" she asked as David tuned his new violin, a Stradivarius on loan from the Rothschild Foundation. David smiled, his fingers finding the strings with the familiarity of someone who had turned adversity into art. "Auntie, Vincent Sterling gave me the greatest gift of my life that night. He gave me an audience." The irony was not lost on him. Vincent had tried to use his position to crush a boy he considered inferior, but had inadvertently created the opportunity for true musical genius to reveal itself to the world. On the night of the Carnegie Hall performance, David played to a sold-out audience that included celebrities, music critics, and sitting in the front row, Margaret Rothschild, now one of the most fervent advocates of music inclusion programs. Vincent Sterling watched the live broadcast from his empty apartment in Queens, where he had moved after losing his penthouse in Manhattan. Every note David played was a reminder of his own moral and professional fall. When David finished his main performance, a devastatingly beautiful rendition of the same partita that had changed everything, he stepped to the microphone to thank the audience. "Music doesn't belong to any of us," he said, his voice echoing through the historic hall. "It exists to connect human hearts regardless of our background or appearance. That is a true democracy of art." The ovation lasted 15 minutes. People cried openly, not just for the beauty of the music, but for the recognition that they had witnessed something transformative, a lesson about how true talent always finds its way, even when faced with the cruelest of obstacles. 2 years later, David would release his first album, which would become the best-selling classical music album of the decade. Vincent Sterling continued to give private lessons at a community school, his international career permanently destroyed by his own arrogance. The difference between them was not just their professional success, but the way each had chosen to use his talent. David used his music to lift others up, establishing educational programs in underserved communities. Vincent had used it to elevate himself above others until he discovered that heights built on prejudice always come crashing down. David Thompson's story has become legendary in music circles, not only for his extraordinary talent, but for proving that true artistic excellence knows no color, social class, or limitations imposed by those who fear greatness in others. As David always said to young students facing discrimination, the best revenge is not to destroy those who hurt you, but to build something greater than they could ever imagine. Have you ever witnessed talent being wasted because of prejudice? How did you react when you saw injustice being disguised as tradition? Share your experiences in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true merit always overcomes empty privilege.